Hello, we're speaking today with Dr. Leonard Sax, and we have some questions for you based on your book, Boys Adrift. So I'm just wondering if you can tell me more about your professional background, your specialization, and what led to your interest in this topic.
Sure. So I earned my undergraduate degree at MIT, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I then went on and earned a doctorate in psychology and an MD, both at the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. Did a 3-year residency in family medicine, and I have been a medical doctor now for more than 30 years. I started to practice outside of Washington, D.C., and I began to notice that there were many families in my practice where the girl's doing well in school and getting good marks, and the boy was not. And I thought, what's wrong with the suburbs of Washington, D.C., that the boys are not motivated? Because I grew up outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and at my high school, the valedictorian was a boy, the editor of the school newspaper was a boy, that at the honors assembly, the boys were greatly overrepresented among those earning highest honors in poetry, English, every academic content area. And this wasn't true in suburban Maryland. So my first question that I began to ask in the late 90s is, what's wrong with these kids? What's wrong with this area? I just assumed it was something local. But I began to reach out to people across the United States initially. And I started with my hometown outside Cleveland, Ohio, and discovered, wow, as of 2000, things are really different. Now the girls are overrepresented. 3/4 of the academic honors are going to girls. The girls are editing the newspaper. I mean, it's great that girls are doing better, but why didn't we plateau around 50-50? Mm-hmm. Why are the boys now underrepresented? And then, so in 2001, I started visiting schools across the United States and then across Canada, and I've visited schools all across Ontario, as well as from BC to Nova Scotia, and have found, of course, the same phenomenon, that across Canada, across the United States, you find this growing gender gap, and the primary driver of the gender gap is not so much that girls are doing better. They are in some domains. But what's really driving it is that boys are doing worse. Mm-hmm. Boys are disengaging. Boys are stepping back. And so I wanted to understand why. I had written a first book called Why Gender Matters, published by Doubleday 2005. But then I really wanted to hone in on this question of Boys Adrift. That's the title I chose. Why are there so many boys who are not keeping up with their sisters, are not motivated to do well? And I really didn't know what I would find, or even if there would be a book there. I assumed, okay, so the central question I began with was, what changed between, say, the mid-'70s and 2000? In the mid-'70s, boys and men were overrepresented among high achievers. By 2000, girls and women were overrepresented, and that's only become more dramatic in the 15, 17 years since. I assumed, going into this, and I've never written this down anywhere, but I assumed that the big change that would explain explain the variance in the data would be the decline of the two-parent household. Mm. In 1970, many boys were raised in a home with their biological father. Mm-hmm. By 2005, that was much less true, especially in low-income neighborhoods. And I assumed that that would be a major factor, maybe the whole story. It turns out it's not. Mm. It's not even one of the top 10. It turns out that I like to give the example of Barack Obama. Barack Obama had a father whom he did not know, who did not raise him. He was raised by a single mom. He has a half-brother who was raised by his father. The half-brother is a wreck. He's got all kinds of psychiatric issues, can't keep a job. Barack Obama, raised by a single mom, did very well. Having a father in the household is not an advantage if the father is a bad father. Mm. That's one of the first things I discovered, looking into the research and talking with the researchers. So the 5 factors that I identified in the book, each was really a surprise to me, mm-hmm. that I didn't know about when I set out to write it, started thinking about these issues in the late 90s.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you. It's very interesting. And you talk a lot about the learning differences between the genders. So given that boys and girls learn differently, How do you think that translates into running therapy groups, let's say for transitional aged males, where they sit for 1.5 to 2 hours in a circle, often with a female therapist, learning skills? Cognitive behavioral therapies used a lot, particularly with those who are have problem technology use. And I'm just kind of wondering if you'd recommend any kind of adaptations that would speak more to their learning needs.
Absolutely. As I mentioned to some of your colleagues this morning, what we're learning from scholarly research, professors like Deborah Tannen at Georgetown and others, is that the way humans communicate is different with girls compared with boys. And incidentally, lesbian, gay, bisexual does not seem to factor into this. Lesbian girls and straight girls communicate in the same way. Straight boys and gay boys communicate in largely the same way. Biological sex, whether you are male or female, constrains and influences how you use language. Sitting in a circle is a great format for many girls, but often not for boys. Now, those sex differences diminish as a function of age. As I mentioned to your colleagues earlier today, girls reach full maturity in terms of brain development by about 22 years of age, boys not until 30 years of age. So when I say an adult man, I mean a man over 30 years of age. And you can do group therapy with men over 30 sitting in a circle. But with teenage boys, I think it's getting pretty clear that that is not best practice. And there's a growing body of research from people working in addictions and teenage offenders that if you're working with more than one client, you really want to think about having single-sex groupings. Work with your girls 1 hour, work with your boys another hour. With the girls, you're going to sit in a circle and let's get to know one another. With your boys, no. With your boys, your group may actually look more like a traditional classroom. With the boys sitting in rows facing you, and you are leading, and you are creating order, and you are saying, Mr. Jefferson, what are your thoughts about that? Mr. Jackson, let's hear from you. Using formal terms of address, at least the first few sessions. With the girls, you're using first names. Lisa, I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. What do you think about that, Vanessa? So the skilled counselor is creating a different feeling in the all-girls setting compared to the all-boys setting. What's actually happening in the mixed setting, where you have a few girls and with more than half boys, what we've learned about mixed settings, if you're going to have a mix of girls and boys, and you want it to be very close to 50-50. Because if it's mostly boys, the girls sometimes clam up and they don't talk, and the boys want to show how macho they are, and it's a waste of time. Or it's very difficult for that to be a productive setting. I do think there's a growing body of research that in group therapy with teenagers, you want to do one session with the girls and a separate session with the boys. I'm not at all saying that's true for adults. Again, an adult means a woman over 22, a man over 30. I've seen group be very effective with a mixed male-female group of adults. AA can do that. Alcoholics Anonymous, can be very successful with middle-aged men and women sitting in a circle talking with one another. But 15-year-old boys are not adults.
And if you do sort of that more classroom setting, even if the boys are not defiant or there's no sort of legal issues, but rather there's problem tech use, so there is potential addiction, often things like mood and anxiety or ADHD or ASD, would it still be true that you want to address them formally and kind of start off in a more organized way?
What counselors are finding when they work with troubled youth, and in my book, Boys Adrift, I close the book with what I learned from the founders and leaders of a group called Boys to Men, which is based in California. And they're all about creating a sense of brotherhood, that we want you to get to know one another in a group setting. We're going to meet on a weekly basis together. They go to Mount Palomar, a mountain in California, and fix up the lodge and do chores together. That experience of doing manual work together with other boys your age, with a man who is leading you. There's something almost tribal about that. It resonates with boys, and they love it, and they look forward to it, and they want to be accountable to one another. So I think we're learning about some really interesting and innovative ways of working with troubled teen youth. And what we're learning is that what works best with boys is not what works best with girls. Giving a bunch of girls some lumber with nails in it and say, okay, here's some hammer. I want you to all pull the nails out of this lumber so we can use it. The girls are going to be like, this is like totally stupid. Like, why should we have to do this? But the boys are like, yeah, excellent. And you bring the boys together and form those bonds. The big differences between girls and boys are not in what they can do, but in what they want to do. I mean, girls are perfectly capable of pulling the nails out of the lumber, but it's like boring. And talking about personal events in their own lives comes very easily for some teen girls, but not for many boys. Many boys don't want to talk in a group setting about personal events.
So it's very interesting because it kind of raises questions for me in the context that many of us work in. So for example, I work in a hospital setting where there's limitations in terms of maybe doing one-on-one stuff or even group stuff outside of the walls of the hospital. And we tend to go with evidence-informed modalities for addiction. So for example, like I was saying earlier, cognitive and behavioral therapy. And so in a way, it almost seems contraindicated based on what the way you said that boys have learned, because it's very homework based. It's not about, learning experientially necessarily all the time, at least in the context of that group setting. It's about, we're going to teach you about this topic, and then maybe you'll go away and do some homework. So I guess I'm just sort of wondering, within the confines of that kind of environment, how can we use some of your principles to engage these boys?
Well, I come back to my concept that I shared a moment ago, that the big differences between girls and boys are not in what they can do, but in what they want to do. The boy is just as able as the girl to talk about his feelings, to talk about his mindset, but maybe he doesn't want to because he doesn't think it's cool. So again, what people like Boys II Men in California and others are finding is that if you create a context where it's cool to be engaged, to care. Because again, for so many North American Anglophone boys, what's really cool is saying, I don't care. I don't care. I am not invested. Gordon Neufeld, the great, I consider him a very great psychologist based in Western Canada, but he's talked about the mask. He spent 40 years working with troubled Canadian youth. And he said, so many of these boys have the mask. And the mask is, I don't care, no big deal, I'm not interested, count me out. That's cool in the eyes of many Canadian boys. And so he'll bring them into his office and sit with them shoulder to shoulder. And he insisted, when they were creating a new facility, he said, I must have a washroom in my office. And they said, well, your pay grade really doesn't warrant you having your own private washroom. He said, it's not for me, it's for the boys. Because when they cry, they need to have a place they can clean up, because you don't want them to go back into the facility and the other boys see that they've been crying. They have to be able to wash their face and go out clean. And they gave him the washroom when they built the new facility in Vancouver. You got to get behind the mask. And he found, and I have found, and many have found, that the way you do that with girls is very different from the way you do that with boys. And if you ignore that, if you pretend that gender doesn't matter, you're going to be less effective.
Do you feel like it would be advantageous to actually name it? So that's sort of, the sort of limitations in terms of socialization around men not being given permission to show emotion in particular ways, maybe anger but not sadness, for example. Do you think it would be advantageous to actually talk through that, either individually or in a group setting, to name it?
Not with 14-year-old boys.
No.
Crying. It's not unusual to find a 14-year-old girl who said, I just needed a good cry.
Mm-hmm.
She feels better after crying. That never happens. Well, maybe I should say almost never. I've never seen that happen with a 14-year-old boy. A 14-year-old boy who cries in a group setting is likely to feel embarrassed, is likely to feel humiliated. Pushing that boy to the point that he's breaking into tears, he's going to be upset and embarrassed and not want to come back. That girl who cries in public, that's okay. Now, we don't need to argue about whether that's socially constructed or not. It doesn't matter. The reality is the girl's okay crying in a group setting and the boy is not. And you need to respect that and not pretend that it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. And so how would you encourage maybe the identification, their ability to identify their own emotions and maybe express them in more constructive ways, or to get that emotion out if crying doesn't feel like an option in a group or even on their own? How might you encourage a boy to get that angst out depending on what he's upset about?
It's more likely to come out if you're engaged in another focus. So, as I said to your colleagues earlier today, girls' friendships are face-to-face. They talk to each other. Boys are shoulder to shoulder. They're looking out at something. So what they do at Boys to Men, they've got this lumber that they'd like to be able to use, but it's used, it's got nails in it. So they give the boys hammers and say, okay, I want you to use the end of the hammer to pry the nails out. And as the boys are working on this group of lumber, they start to talk. And then they can talk about anything, and they can talk about their own experiences, and they do. And that's again, I talk to the men who lead these things, and they say, you'll be amazed what comes out in half an hour. Yeah. The boys are very comfortable. You got a grown-up there who's making things stay in bounds, but the boys lead the conversation. Yeah. If they're comfortable, boys will talk just as much as girls will talk if they're comfortable. But how you get them comfortable is different. You get boys comfortable by giving them a bunch of old lumber with nails in it to pry the nails out. That's not necessary or best practice with girls. With girls, you put them in a circle and let them talk.
So I guess it sort of makes me think about how we can task them with something, even in the context of working in a community agency or a hospital where maybe those kinds of outings aren't possible. But maybe even tasking them with something in a group where they get to work together, but they're not face-to-face talking about the most emotionally charged issues.
Well, and another format that's been very successful, again, most of my work has been with schools. And I can tell you about many schools in the public boards that have been successful assigning boys to teams. Last name A through K is on Alpha team, S through Z is on Bravo team. And you're going to clean this room, you're going to clean that room, and whoever cleans it best gets a prize. And the prize could be you get to go to lunch 5 minutes early. It doesn't have to cost anything. But competition engages boys. This is not effective with girls. If Sonia and Vanessa are best friends and you put them on opposing teams, Sonia's going to say, I don't want to beat Vanessa. I don't want to make her sad. I want to work with Vanessa. I don't even know these other girls. But team competition is a great way of motivating boys. If Justin and Jason are best friends and you put them on opposing teams for the football game, Justin will happily run down the field and knock down Jason, his friend, and avoid the big boy he doesn't know. Researchers find that boys prefer to compete against friends. Girls prefer to compete with their friends against strangers. So team competition can be a very effective format in a residential setting, working with boys. Again, I'm referring to some of the work I've done with the Ministry of Children and Youth Services, residential facilities, both secure and non-secure. The team competitive format can be very effective with boys.
Yeah, it's a very interesting concept, and it's come up a little bit in some group work that we were doing in terms of engaging young people who really, for the most part, do not want to be there. We're in an outpatient setting. Often the parents have dragged their kids there because they've identified concerns around their kids' withdrawal from family life, sleep issues, academic performance. And so a lot of the kids that come don't want to be there. We stick them in a group, in a circle, as I said before, and people have made attempts at being a bit more creative and had them compete. And some of the feedback that we got, and I actually think it was from one of the clients, was, I found that kind of triggering because I'm trying not to game, and competition is what makes me want to game.
Well, I'm very specific when I do that workshop about what form the competition takes. So, for example, taking foul shots, trying to get the basketball in the basket from the foul line. Every kid is going to be expected to take 3 shots, but you give them plenty of notice. Again, when I'm talking about a residential facility where kids are going to be there for months, you say, okay, a week from Friday, we're going to do this. And that gives every kid the chance to practice. The thing about taking a shot, trying to get a basketball in a basket, is any kid who doesn't have a major physical disability, if they practice, they will improve. And so now you're engaging this kid, you're co-opting him, you're bringing him into your program, and he may spend many minutes a day taking foul shots because he doesn't want to embarrass his team. And that can be really motivating. But you do have to be very specific about what form the competition takes. It can't be a spelling bee, for example, because a lot of boys will say, well, I don't know how to spell and I have no interest in learning how to spell. Go ahead. I don't care. So spelling bees are not a good format, but everyone is going to take 3 shots from the foul line. That has worked. Obstacle course, you have to run along a balance beam, a series of balance beams. That has worked. Again, you let the kids practice, and that's great. It gives them something to do that's constructive, that doesn't involve an electronic screen.
So it's interesting because, I mean, you talk about sort of innate differences in the genders, and in some ways the idea maybe to be how to channel those innate differences in a healthy way. So, I mean, in your book you talk about how some of that stuff gets channeled within video games, wanting to be a man, wanting to feel powerful. Things like competition is something that a lot of the clients cite as being one of the reasons they love gaming, achievement, competition. So if we can channel that into something that's in real life rather than virtual life, it seems like for a lot of people that might be very productive.
I love your word channel, and I want to share with you a story we didn't have time for earlier today. It's my favorite story, certainly from the province of Ontario. So this comes from Thunder Bay, and this is from Youth Justice. So Thunder Bay is a small town on the North Shore of Lake Superior. They don't have organized gangs, but they do have, kids who get in trouble. And among this particular group of boys, and this was way back in 2001 before the change in the law, to kind of earn your status among these boys, you had to commit a felony. You had to do something really bad. So they challenged this boy, and he broke into an old woman's house and stole her jewelry, and then went to the local pawn shop and sold it, and gave his real name, so the detective found him like in a day, and he was arrested and convicted. And back then in 2001, before they changed the law, conviction on a felony, he was incarcerated. So this story comes from the detention facility in Thunder Bay. The director had a friend who owned a lumber yard. I keep coming back to lumber. And the owner of the lumber yard said they had a defective shipment that was warped, and it couldn't be used as lumber, but it would make great firewood. And in Thunder Bay, there are old homes that turns out there are elderly people there relying on firewood, and sometimes they're colder than they should be because firewood's expensive. So the director knew about the nonprofit that knew who the low-income elderly were, and he had his friend who was willing to donate the wood. All he needed to do was a mechanism to deliver the wood. So he said, I want some volunteers. He's talking to the incarcerated juveniles. I want some volunteers to deliver this wood. And this boy who'd broken into the old woman's house, he volunteered. And it's December, Thunder Bay, it's cold, it's windy, and it's crazy cold. And so they're driving around, they've done 1 or 2 deliveries, and the director says, okay, we can't do it today. crazy cold, windy. We're all going to die. We got to go back to the facility. But this boy said, no, come on. The old people, they're expecting us today. We got to do it today. And so he said, all right. And it just turned out the very next home was the elderly woman that this boy had broken into her house. And now he is braving the driving wind and the cold to stack firewood. Boys want to seem heroic in their own eyes. They want to prove to themselves that they're real men. If we channel that, to use your word, if we channel that constructively, then you've got a boy who's braving the elements to stack firewood for an old woman. If we don't channel it, we've got a boy who's breaking into the woman's house to steal from her.
Or playing video games like Grand Theft Auto.
Or playing video games to prove to himself that he's a real man.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely right. That's our challenge as professionals who work with these kids, to recognize the differences between girls and boys. Understand girls want to be seen as women. What does that mean? Boys want to be seen as men. If we don't channel that, we're going to have boys who are engaging in risk-taking behavior, whether it's gambling or criminal offenses. But if we channel it, that same boy who was a criminal becomes a hero.
So that makes me think of the concept that you talk about in the book called will to power, and how we channel that in boys. So, I mean, if you could just speak to briefly what will to power is and how we might help them channel that.
So that's from my chapter on video games, which I discovered really is one of these major factors driving the disengagement of boys from the real world and connecting them into this virtual world where they can be masters of the universe. So Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher, coined this phrase, der Wille zur Macht, the will to power. What does that mean? It means you want to be in charge. Well, everybody wants to be in charge. You know, women don't want to be told what to do, neither do men. And I quote Nietzsche at some length in that chapter. He says, what does it mean? It means that the will to power is more important than anything else, more important than being liked, more important than being happy. That person in whom the will to power is primary tritt mit Füßen, stomps with his feet on those other drives. He doesn't care about it. And the video games get it. Okay, so when researchers look at who's playing violent video games like Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed, 20 hours a week, boys greatly outnumber girls. Because, girls like to be in charge, but very few girls, it turns out, get real visceral pleasure out of destroying the enemy. They'd rather hang out with real people and whom they like and who like them. That's a much higher priority than killing imaginary aliens. But for boys, that sensation of being in command, in control, can be primary, and the video games feed that. And so you will find boys who are perfectly happy spending 20 hours a week playing violent video games, and that's really unusual to find a girl who's spending 20 hours a week playing violent video games.
So healthy, innate need, unhealthy outlet. So if they were coming into counseling, or if we were coaching parents to help them kind of channel the will to power in a more pro-social or healthy way that isn't as damaging to them, do you have any suggestions about what that might look like?
Bonds across generations. Can create bonds across generations. So if this boy loves shooting things, I say, great. We've got a skeet club. Meets not far from here. I personally don't know the first thing about it, have no interest in it, but I'm going to hook you up with that. And then you're going to be mostly men, because who wants to spend their free time shooting at clay pigeons? It's mostly men. And you're creating bonds across generations. And now this boy loves to shoot things, loves to have that satisfaction of aiming and hitting, but now he's doing it in the real world with a community of men who are teaching him something about handling an actual firearm, hitting an actual object, and most importantly, you're creating a bond with an adult man. And that's what troubled youth especially need. Boys need a connection with an adult man. Girls need a connection with adult women. Maybe there's no such healthy connection in the home. Okay, well then let's try and create it outside the home. If this boy goes to the skeet club twice a month, it's going to have a measurable effect. And again, in my book, Boys Adrift, I share this research showing that even if it's just once a month that he's with a community of men that he feels cares about him, that he is accountable to, it gives him a different frame of reference. And over 7 years, we find that boy becomes much less likely to engage in delinquent behavior, to be adjudicated.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm just going to shift gears a little bit to sort of family life and, a common kind of scenario that we see coming into our clinic. And that's, again, a transitional age young male, usually 16 and above. It's not uncommon for them to be over 18, refusing to sit down to dinner with the family despite them being called multiple times. Parents seem to have a lot of fear around taking the technology away. Their experience with it is that their son becomes belligerent, sometimes aggressive and violent, punching holes in walls. And when you get down to the nitty-gritty, often they don't want to call the police. Either there might be, cultural reasons. They don't want the child to have a criminal record because it'll impact their future. Maybe the child is depressed, and so regardless of what they take away, it doesn't seem to motivate their son. So those, I think, are some of the trickiest situations we find ourselves in. And feel kind of stuck sometimes with those families when, maybe the only options seem to either be asking the child to leave or calling the police.
You're raising a really important point. And again, I've been a medical doctor for 30 years, and I've seen this firsthand, how North American Anglophone parents increasingly are afraid of their own kids. And this is true, incidentally, across the demographic categories. I find this in affluent homes. I'm talking to this affluent mother and saying, you mustn't let your daughter take her mobile phone to bed with her, because at 2 a.m. she's getting a text. And the text is, OMG, Emily and Jason just broke up. This is really big news. We'll have to talk about this. And your daughter's up for an hour in the middle of the night, and she's anxious. And I think part of that is she's sleep deprived. She's not getting enough sleep. Look, the rules of good parenting have not changed in 20 years. But 20 years ago, a girl could not accept a phone call at 2 a.m. to exchange gossip for an hour in the middle of the night, because the phone would ring and the parents would not allow it, because they knew it's more important for a kid to get a good night's sleep than to be up for an hour in the middle of the night. That was true 20 years ago, and it's just as true today. What has changed is the technology. Now this girl has a mobile phone. It's very easy for her to accept the text message at 2 a.m. because the phone never rang, it buzzed, and she's not talking, she's texting. But just because it's easy doesn't mean it should happen. And you have to empower parents to do the right thing. And I tell parents, at 9 o'clock at night, the very latest, you turn off the device, it goes in the charger, which stays in the parent's bedroom. She can have it back tomorrow morning. And I'll say this to parents, doesn't matter if they're low income or affluent, the parent will say, oh, I couldn't do that. She would just throw a fit if I took her phone away. And I empower the parent and say, you must do this. It's not reasonable to put this burden on your 14-year-old daughter. What's she supposed to say tomorrow in school when her friend says, hey, I texted you last night at midnight. How come you didn't answer? Is this girl supposed to say, well, researchers have found that sleep deprivation in adolescence is a major risk factor? That's ridiculous. You have to allow her to say, hey, my evil parents take my phone every night at 9. Well, won't let me have it back till the next morning. And I walk the parent through it. I say, okay, tell your daughter that I, Dr. Sax, told you to take her phone, turn it off, at 9 o'clock she can have it back tomorrow morning. Your daughter will then say to you, but I use it as my alarm clock. Let her know they still make actual alarm clocks. You can go to the store and buy one. They're only a few dollars. And then she gets really upset. And she says, but what if there's an emergency? Remind her that you still have a landline, a house phone, in the parent's bedroom. If there's a true emergency, her friend is welcome to call the house phone, and you, the parent, will pick up, and you, the parent, will decide whether this emergency warrants waking up at 2 a.m. It probably doesn't. It can probably wait. And that's really the focus of my book titled The Collapse of Parenting, which is that so many North American Anglophone parents, now are afraid of their own kids, that they're not doing their job. The basic things parents should do, like making sure your kid can get a good night's sleep because they don't have a device in their bedroom. That's not just my opinion. The American Academy of Pediatrics has emphatically recommended no devices in the bedroom, no phones in the bedroom. They're looking at the research. It's not a guess. We know that kids who have phones in the bedroom get less sleep, less restful sleep, lots of bad outcomes. You don't want your kid to have a phone in the bedroom. But the parents are afraid of their kids. In the collapse of parenting, I compare the North America, especially the United States, with United Kingdom, Germany, Switzerland, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, all countries where I've spoken on this topic and where we have good research. Kids in the United Kingdom are just as likely to have mobile phones as kids in the United States. And yet, in the United Kingdom, they don't take their phones to bed with them. The parents wouldn't dream of it. It's very unusual. And I've spoken to parents in visits all across England and Scotland on this. And of course, my child doesn't take their mobile to bed with them. Only Americans would do that. Where are Canadians? Canadians are drifting away from the United Kingdom toward the United States. Canadian parents increasingly are acting like American parents. They're abandoning their authority. They're letting kids take phones to bed with them, letting kids decide things that parents should decide. And that's not a good thing. I talked at length with Dr. Gordon Neufeld about this, and we both agreed that Canadian parents are drifting toward American practice, that you don't want to be an American parent. Be more mindful of, strengthen ties with the Commonwealth, try to be more like, practice the way that parents in New Zealand, Australia, and Scotland do. Vacation there if you possibly can, get a sense of what that culture is like, and stay away from the United States.
So we're seeing it here, and anecdotally, I haven't seen if there's any research on this, but we're seeing it here cross-culturally, this sort of lack of agency that parents feel around setting limits and enforcing them with their kids. One of the things that becomes more challenging as kids age, because most of the kids in our clinic are well above 14, is that when their kid's 21, taking their phone away, when their kid's actually paying for their own phone, their own data, their own internet, taking it away. So that becomes a challenge too, in terms of what that looks like. The parents are often maybe even physically afraid of their kids. So they feel like, well, what am I supposed to do if the kid's not giving up the technology, get into a physical altercation with them? Or what am I supposed to do if the kid's refusing to go to school? I can't throw him in the car or make him go to treatment. So that's often kind of when the parents come in without the kids, or even when they come in with the kids, one of the struggles that we have.
Yeah, in Boys Adrift, I shared a story from my own practice where parents had a 22-year-old son whose primary activity is playing video games. And he's very forthcoming about this. We add up the hours. At a typical week, he's spending more than 40 hours playing video games. It's basically a full-time job. Mm-hmm. His father is a self-employed contractor, and the son supposedly helps the father, but often will just say he won't. Mm-hmm. So when I met with your colleagues earlier today, I shared basic guidelines for use of video games developed by the researchers, 40 minutes a night playing video games on school nights, an hour a day on weekends. But that doesn't apply to addicts. Who's the addict? What's addiction? Addiction has been a major focus of my professional work as a psychologist and physician for 30 years. Who's addicted to alcohol? It's not a function of how much you drink. The characteristic of addiction is loss of control. A man goes to an AA meeting and say, hey, my name's Steve. It's 12 years and 3 months since my last drink, and I am an alcoholic. He doesn't say I used to be an alcoholic. He hasn't had a drink in 12 years, but he is an alcoholic because he knows that if he has one drink, he may not be able to stop. Loss of control defines the addict. How does that transfer into video games? It's 9 o'clock at night. The boy has an exam at school tomorrow, and he would like to do well in the exam. He figures he'll just play for half an hour. At 2 a.m, he's still playing. Mom comes into the bedroom to suggest that he turns off the device, and he becomes violent and abusive. He's an addict. The rule for the addict is complete abstinence. So these parents had a 22-year-old son who's spending 40 hours a week playing video games, who is clearly addicted. Now, the question of whether video game addiction exists is controversial right now. It's settled in my mind. Most boys are not addicts. This boy is. He's truly addicted. He cannot control his gaming. The rule for him is total abstinence. Destroy the machine. Give it away. If he's going to a friend's house, you call them and say, will there be games there? Okay, then he can't go. Just like if your husband was an alcoholic, you wouldn't send him to a cocktail party. Complete abstinence. And that's what they did. And he was very angry. And they said the first week he wouldn't even talk to them. He was angry. He wouldn't eat with them. But after the first week, the parents did not back down. And after the first week, he started talking with them. He started going out with Dad on jobs, and Dad was amazed how bright he was and how he could figure things out that Dad couldn't figure out. And then they came back to see me at 6 weeks. And the parents were like, wow, it's a revelation. We had no idea he was so clever, so good with his hands, so good at understanding written instructions as we're doing these jobs. Dad can't figure out how to install this high-tech equipment, but the son can. And then I said to the son, what do you think? He said, I haven't changed. He was not willing, at least, to acknowledge any improvement. He had no insight into the way that the video games were undermining his real world experience and how he had improved as a result of not playing the real world. So many parents are afraid of their kids, and they're waiting for the kids to have some insight, some awareness of how the video games are ruining their real lives. Don't wait. He's not an adult. He won't be an adult till 30 years of age. If you wait till he's 30, that's too long.
And I guess I can see sort of at different stages and different ages where that would feel more possible. And and maybe it's because CAMH is a tertiary care facility where people only come when they're at the more severe end of the spectrum. So one of the challenges is that their kids might be suffering from co-occurring mental health issues. And I've had parents say, well, we took it away and my kid's depressed and he won't get out of bed and he won't go to school. And they have to tolerate weeks and weeks and weeks of that without it even changing. Or they see that their kid, or they know that their kid has autism spectrum disorder and really, really lacks social skills. And they recognize that not only is their mood, but other sort of psychosocial needs being met by them being online, gaming or not. And so that becomes really contentious in terms of, the efficacy of just taking it away because they can't seem to mobilize them or find other ways to meet their needs that the technology is meeting.
And I have been there, and I agree with you completely that these kids on the spectrum really has difficulty interacting with people socially, but is very comfortable in the video game world. That's not a reason to let him spend 20 hours a week in front of a screen. On the contrary, we now have good evidence from longitudinal studies that's going to undermine his social skills. You need to work with him on his social skills, which you develop by interacting face-to-face with real people. You don't learn how to communicate as a human being by playing video games. And that's no longer a guess. We now have very good research, which I cite in my book, Boys Adrift, defending that statement, that video games actually undermine social skills. And you've got a boy on the spectrum, he needs all the help he can get, working on his social skills, on his self-control. And video games will not help that. They may hinder that. But that kid who's anxious, who's depressed, I have seen so many times that it's very hard to tell which is the chicken and which is the egg. This boy, thinking of another boy now, mom confronts him and she says, what's your problem? Talking about a different boy. You wake up late every day, you work a few hours a week at the coffee shop, you're 28 years old. You don't have a life. And all he wants to do is play video games and look at pornography. But he's anxious. And he's anxious because at some level he realizes his life is not going in the right direction and that he is incompetent in the real world. And he doesn't want to face that. And so he's got this growing anxiety about the fact that in the real world, he's a failure. But when I talk to him, he says, well, I'm level 85. You know what that means? I said, yes, actually, that's a reference to World of Warcraft. You're a guild master. He said, that's right. You know what that means? I said, yeah, it means you're master of the guild. He said, it means there are people in Singapore, in Liverpool, England, and Johannesburg, South Africa, who bow down to me. This is not where you want this boy to be. He is invested in this online persona. But in the real world, he's a failure who has no friends. I asked him, who are your friends? And he said, real names or gamer handles? I said, well, tell me, when's the last time anyone came over to your house? He said, oh, I know what you're getting at. You're saying that real world friendship is more important than friendship online. I said, yeah, actually, I do believe that. No one's been to his house. He hasn't been to anyone's house in at least a year. His friends are his guild members in World of Warcraft, whom he has never seen in the real world and never will see. That boy has a lot of problems. He's underneath it. He's anxious. He's depressed. But letting him spend 20 hours a week playing video games is not a solution. On the contrary, it's making the problem worse.
And I guess I'm just sort of thinking about what you're saying about abstinence, and it makes sense if it's around a particular activity that someone's lost total control over. And at many organizations, including CAMH, we work from a harm reduction model, which means that we'll work with people even on a goal that's sort of around controlled use. And so that's the stance we take so that we could at least engage them at any point in the process and maybe mitigate some of the harm that the behavior has on their life. But often, of course, what we see, and I'm sure this would be no surprise to you, that they end up gaming more than they intended, sometimes with consequence, when they're working on a controlled
Well, this
goal.
is when the clinician really has to use her professional judgment. So in alcohol, we got good literature distinguishing alcohol abuse from alcoholism. Alcohol abuse is the person who's abusing alcohol. For example, the person who's drinking heavily to get to sleep. They're using alcohol as a way, as an aid to sleep and as a way of relieving anxiety. That's abusing alcohol. But that person's not an alcoholic. They're using alcohol inappropriately to deal with their difficulties with sleep, to deal with their anxiety. Okay, I know how to intervene with that person. I can get them in counseling. And as a physician, I will also prescribe a medication like trazodone, very safe medication to help them to get to sleep and stay asleep, not habit forming, not addictive. But I'm not going to prohibit that person from using alcohol. They're not an alcoholic. They've been abusing alcohol, but they can use alcohol appropriately. You have to use your clinical judgment to determine, is that person abusing alcohol or are they alcoholic? So you have to listen to their story. But if that person says, I wanted to go to my son's birthday, and on the way I thought I'd just stop at the bar and have a drink, and 12 hours later I was still at the bar and I missed my son's birthday. Okay, bingo. That's an alcoholic. That's not abusing alcohol. That's worse. That's an alcoholic. That's a person who's lost control. And for them, the rule, I feel, is total abstinence. So you, the clinician, have to figure out, can you just use this substance appropriately, or do you have to abstain completely? Depends.
So I guess you're sort of suggesting that we make recommendations based on what we know around someone who's lost total control. And we may have a client that's still not willing to do that. They just don't want to give up their games. And so I'm just kind of wondering how you might kind of work with that.
Well, it depends on the setting. If this is a boy living in his parents' home, doesn't matter if he's 15 or 25, if the parents are paying the rent, and he's sleeping in their home, the parents have every right to say, if you are living in this home, there will be no video games until the chores are done. And if you're in school, your homework is done. And if you're 25 years of age, we expect you to be working for pay. And you need to get a job. But I've been involved in situations where the boy doesn't. He's 25 years old and he refuses. And that's a really difficult situation. The most discouraging situation is mom calls me and says, I wonder if I can bring my son to see you. He's not working, not looking for work, spends all his time playing video games and looking at pornography. He's 32 years old. That's very discouraging because the honest answer I have to give that parent is, I don't have much to offer you. You will have to give your son an ultimatum that you must get a job or I will kick you out of the home. Knowing that if you do that, he may end up homeless. That has happened in my experience. And it's very difficult for a parent to do that. So I don't have a good answer. But I'm much more optimistic if that boy is 15 years of age or 24 years of age. Again, this research from the Hospital for Sick Children here in Toronto, from the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, and elsewhere, showing that boys don't reach full maturity in brain development until 30 years of age. If that boy is 15, if that boy is 24, if the parents make the rules clear, he can change. If he's 32, the brain is less plastic, and the odds are not as good.
So do you have any sort of success stories around parents who really fear their kids, don't feel a sense of agency, don't feel permission to set limits with them? Do you have any sort of tips around kind of really empowering parents to kind of take some of their power back?
So the most dramatic story I think I've ever encountered is from a husband and wife in Mobile, Alabama, who have raised 3 kids themselves and are now doing foster parenting, and heard about a boy in the system, 12 years of age, defiant, disrespectful, had been through multiple foster homes, bad history, abusive parents when he was younger. The system had taken him into custodial care. And then another family had said, well, we know how to work with these kids. The answer is love. We're just going to love him. And that husband and wife actually began the process of adopting this boy. But then a few months in, they said, no, we can't do it. He's incorrigible. We've tried loving him and he hates us back. He's full of hate. So this man and woman that I talked to, they brought this boy into their home. And they said the first week was a challenge. He was defiant and disrespectful. But you know what? He's a wonderful kid, and we are going to adopt him. He's a wonderful kid. He is creative, imaginative, and it turns out he's very loving. So what do you do? Don't be cute. Sit your kid down and say, you know what? I've been doing some things wrong. There are not going to be any more screens in the bedroom. No games until the homework is done and the chores are done. No screens at the dinner table. No earbuds or headsets in the car. When you're in the car, I'm going to listen to you. And you're going to listen to me, not to Justin Bieber or Miley Cyrus or Akon or Eminem. We're going to talk. The first day you say this, there will be an explosion and a tantrum. But if there are 2 parents, if both parents stand their ground, I can tell you from firsthand experience, after 6 weeks, there will be a change. The first week will be difficult, but stand your ground. Again, I'll send you a copy of my book, The Collapse of Parenting, which is written for that parent. It's not a grumpy old guy saying, parents these days don't know how to do it. It's my experience as a clinician sharing strategies I've seen work, very concrete tips to prioritize the family. Family comes first. Again, so many North American parents, they want their kids to be popular. And their affluent parents are driving their kids from hockey practice to a friend's house, eating supper in the car from the hockey rink to the friend's house. And the unintended message they're sending is that family is the lowest priority. Dr. Frank Algar at McGill, looking nationwide in Canada, has found the family meal at home. He interviewed over 10,000 adolescents across Canada, he and his large team, obviously. How many meals have you had at home with a parent in the last 7 days? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. And then they looked at anxiety, depression, pro-social behavior, and they found with every step, with every additional meal, you decrease anxiety, you decrease depression, you increase pro-social behavior and life satisfaction. You've got to fight for the family meal at home. You've got to prioritize the family. So again, my book, The Collapse of Parenting, is sharing what I've learned about and tips I have for parents that, I'm a parent myself, and I learned a lot. And I don't hesitate to say, you know what? You're not going to that party because we made that as a date for the family. Family comes first.
And I guess we hear terms like helicopter parents and bulldozer parents. And so, sometimes I wonder about, not letting your kid try and fail, or, your anxiety maybe has you kind of over-parenting sometimes, particularly when you see that your kid has challenges, social anxiety, low social skills, ADHD, ASD. There might be more of a temptation for parents to get involved and not let their kids find their way.
It's got to be the right kind of involvement. So we actually have good data on this. The amount of time that fathers spend with their children in a week has roughly tripled over the last 30 years, from just over 2 hours to just over 6 hours. The fathers are spending more time with kids. But if it's not the right kind of time, you're not getting a good outcome. If the father is spending time with his kids, chauffeuring them from hockey to a play date, that's not the time they need. Cancel the play date and schedule father-daughter time just to do something fun together, even if it's just walking to the coffee shop. The parent-child relationship has to be the priority. And again, Dr. Gordon Neufeld, his book, Hold On to Your Kids. It's not a great title. It's a wonderful book. It's not a great title because ultimately parenting is about letting go of your kids, letting them fail. But I can tell you as a non-celebrity authors like me and Dr. Neufeld, we don't get to choose our titles. And I suspect that the publisher chose that title. But the parent-child relationship has to be the most important relationship. And if you're working with troubled kids, then you, the professional, have to teach that parent, that guardian, how to prioritize the relationship, to spend fun time with your kid. I devote a chapter of my book, The Collapse of Parenting. It's titled Enjoy. Not studying Spanish or French with them, not driving them to the hockey rink, but just doing something fun together.
And it's not too late when they're 21 or 25.
The younger they are, the easier it is. I share a story of a 8-year-old boy whose parents divorced, and dad had been convicted on selling marijuana, so the court awarded full custody to mom. And then mom was convicted on and sent to an American prison. And the social worker said, "Dad, you got full custody because mom's in jail." But the son hated dad and didn't want to have anything to do with him. And he said, "You know what? We're going up to Blue Mountain. We're going to go tubing." Son had no idea what he's talking about. And dad says, "Doesn't matter. Get in the car. Seatbelt on." And son is complaining and screaming, "I don't want to do this. Let's go home. Come on. I'm going to call 911. And then they get to the mountain. The son's never been to a ski resort. He's never seen anything like this before. And goes up the hill, comes down the tube. It's like, wow, this is the greatest thing ever. And in one day, this dad changed his relationship with his son by compelling him to do something fun. You can do that in one day with an 8-year-old. At age 15, it's going to take a week, maybe a month. At age 21, it could take a very long time. The older the kid, the greater the challenge. At age 30, I'm I'm not convinced there's any evidence-based intervention that's going to change who this kid is and how they relate to their parent. But with kids, with women under 22, with men under 30, you can do it. That's the message I have for parents, for guardians. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thanks for your
Sax.
time. Thank you.